Let me know when y'all can see my screen.
I can see it now.
Looks good.
Got it. Cool. Okay. Okay. So just quick disclaimer. I did have to shift gears slightly a little bit. I apologize. We have a fairly extensive like approval system with legal in terms of demos and stuff externally. So we will definitely be talking about Kubernetes at Google. There will be a stronger focus on Anthos than I had originally intended. I'll definitely dive into GKE and like what some of the differentiators are for GKE and Anthos. And we'll briefly touch on just like the history of containerization at Google, but I wasn't able to get everything approved that I was hoping to. So first, appreciate you all having me today. Super excited to be here. Start to build a relationship with this group. My name is Noah Mercado, and I am a customer engineer here at Google. I am supporting enterprise accounts, so that's essentially like $10 billion in revenue plus in the Philadelphia market. Basically, Philly, born and raised. I was born in Bucks County, lived there till I was about 5. Grew up in South Jersey before I went to Temple. Super proud Temple fan. I always make sure to reference it every chance I get. Post-graduation, I moved into the healthcare space and then spent some time there, which is where I got developed more of my cloud architecture, cloud engineering skills before moving into consulting, where I supported pharmaceutical and FinServ clients. Been very fortunate to be able to wear a lot of hats in my career. So I've played the roles of software engineer, cloud architect, SRE, DevOps, MLOps engineer, a lot of the fancy buzzwords that we like to throw around today. So super excited to be here. And I live in, I say Washington Square because it sounds a lot nicer. I'm down on South Street right now, but the nicest neighborhood to me is probably Washington Square. So that's what I go by. Cool. So high level, so starting with Anthos, right? Anthos is Google Cloud's what we like to call our application modernization platform. So as a customer engineer at Google, I am customer facing. I am part of an engineering team that supports a sales team. And my specialty is application modernization. So that's things like serverless, Kubernetes, if you're familiar with GCP, App Engine, most of like the serverless type offerings. Anthos is our like cream of the crop application modernization platform. And it's built around, it really enables this idea of building solutions to be cloud agnostic, right? So this idea of writing the code once, building your software once, and having the ability to run it anywhere. It supports Google Cloud, as well as all the major cloud providers, AWS, Azure, you name it, as well as your on-premise data center footprint. So under the hood, Anthos is essentially a Kubernetes-based platform, right? We kind of packaged up Kubernetes as well as a couple of other core components that I'll cover in the next slide. And we were seeing this issue in the market where folks they wanted to leverage the benefits of having a managed Kubernetes service in these cloud providers. So EKS for AWS or AKS for Azure, GKE for GCP. But every one of those Kubernetes distros kind of has their own slight flavor. Which means that if your organization chose to go with a multi-cloud strategy, right, you were learning essentially 3 different flavors of Kubernetes, and you had to operate against 3 different control planes, which made management very, very difficult, right? So Anthos is essentially meant to be the standard control plane that allows you to deploy and manage Kubernetes clusters across your entire cloud ecosystem for multi-cloud as well as hybrid. Anthos is made up of these like 5 core components. So we have Anthos Config Manager, and we'll dive into each of these to kind of cover some of the technicals around them. Anthos Config Management for application development. We have Cloud Run. So if you're familiar with GCP, Cloud Run is it's kind of like a container orchestration service. I think it's kind of similar to Lambda in that it has like a 15-minute timeout or so, but it basically allows you to build serverless applications in GCP. And then Anthos, no matter where you've just deployed your Anthos cluster, right, you can extend the Cloud Run functionality to actually run out on the edge in your data center or in any other cloud provider. Anthos Service Mesh, which is essentially Istio, packaged up and kind of managed on your behalf. GKE, which is the actual Kubernetes, and then Stackdriver, which is our operations management suite. And like I said, we'll cover each of these in a little bit more depth. We'll talk about really 3 key personas that we're going to talk about today. So first is the developer and how Anthos helps to enable developers within your organization. Second is that service operator / SRE type role, right? So the folks that are typically care about managing a service mesh, observability into the stack. And then the third persona is the infrastructure operator. So this is the Kubernetes meetup. I'm assuming all of you are familiar with managing Kubernetes clusters as like an infrastructure type operator. So we'll cover that persona as well. Okay. So first, let's kind of take a step back and let's just talk about GKE as a service. Okay. So Google, as you know, has a very extensive history around containers, right? So we've been leveraging containers actually back since 2003. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Borg, but Borg was essentially the predecessor to Kubernetes, right? Borg was the internal container orchestration system that all of Google services are built around, right? So Google Maps, Google Search, all the various APIs that we offer, all are packaged up as containers, deployed via Borg. And this was kind of that 1.0 version of Kubernetes, right? So this is really between 2003, 2006. That's when the term cloud computing started to really take off, right? So I think 2006 was, when AWS S3 launched, which is like the first cloud service, quote unquote. And then you can see all the way down the timeline of how we've kind of evolved from Borg about 15 plus years ago to Anthos today. Right? So we open sourced Kubernetes in 2013. Google is still the primary contributor to the open source Kubernetes project. All of the testing suite and all of like the builds and stuff are actually done on Google Cloud for that open source Kubernetes project. We've open sourced a couple of other tools since then. So Envoy, which Istio leverages. Envoy is essentially a reverse proxy. And so like 2017 timeline, we announced Istio as an open source project for service mesh. And then things like Knative, GKE has been around since, 2015. And then we've evolved to Anthos today, which is essentially GKE anywhere. So GKE, Google Kubernetes Engine has been known to kind of provide the best-in-class Kubernetes experience. Obviously, I am slightly biased being an employee of Google, but I will say, like in all honesty, just like when I first got started in cloud, I started on private cloud. I moved to AWS. Then I moved to Azure. So GCP really is my third cloud. And even when I was working in private cloud, managing OpenShift clusters, working in AWS with AKS and stuff, I always kind of knew GKE to be like the gold standard for Kubernetes, right? Like if you've managed a Kubernetes cluster before, you know that is not a fun task. You're responsible for a lot of different things with keeping the control plane alive and highly available, managing node pools, managing upgrades, all that stuff. And GKE kind of from the get-go has been like they provide the most in terms of value with providing Kubernetes as a managed service, right? So where Google and Google Cloud do a lot of that heavy lifting for you, where you don't have to worry about certain aspects of running a Kubernetes cluster. So we have like a record-breaking node capacity. So we are at 15,000 nodes max per cluster. I think the next closest, someone please correct me if I'm wrong, it's about 3,000 or 5,000, somewhere in that range. I don't know if that's changed since. But GKE also offers a ton of great features around auto scaling, right? So gives you the ability to automatically scale your nodes horizontally as well as vertically. It'll automatically repair nodes in your node pool. There is a functionality for automatically upgrading your nodes in terms of operating system as well as like the Kubernetes distro version. So we have this concept of like a release channel. So you can kind of pin your GKE cluster to a release channel, and you're, say that be like a particular major version, right? We will automatically upgrade your cluster on your behalf, pending whatever release channel, as new stable releases come out. So we have like a stable release channel. Once something has been completely vetted and it's kind of known in the industry to be like, okay, this is a very stable offering of Kubernetes, right? You can pin to that channel and it'll automatically upgrade you. And then there's some more like bleeding edge type offerings if you're looking to like leverage some of the newer bleeding edge functionality of Kubernetes. We are Google, so our whole business model is around data. So we, of course, we offer integration with GPUs and our in-house built TPUs. And then we have a ton of unique security features built around GKE. We offer Windows service containers, which can run side by side with your Linux containers. I'm not sure if anyone else is doing this yet. I haven't seen it. I haven't touched OpenShift for a couple of years, but I know like OpenShift on Windows was not a thing, at least back in like 2018, 2019 timeframe.
Yeah, mixed clusters. That's the first I've heard of that being able to be ran. So that's interesting. Thanks for letting us know.
Yep.
As an AWS
and then we
ambassador, I should
offer
probably know that. Sorry, go ahead.
No, good. I have a couple different certs on AWS. That was like my primary cloud that I've been working on, and I don't remember that being a feature of EKS either.
Yeah.
GKE offers a ton of integration with our Stackdriver suite. So this is now known as Operations Hub, Cloud Operations. So we offer aggregated logging, aggregated metrics. We integrate directly with things like Prometheus, which has been kind of dubbed the open source standard metrics tool for Kubernetes. Yeah. Cool. Okay. So you can think of GKE as your or just Kubernetes as general as your container orchestrator, right? And GKE, to run Kubernetes is no trivial task. GKE helps to manage that control plane on your behalf. It offers those nice features we just talked about. So if you think of GKE as your container orchestrator, you can think of Anthos as your cluster orchestrator, right? You guys had mentioned Rancher, kind of similar, and we'll talk about a couple of the key features here. So the persona we're kind of covering with Anthos in terms of GKE is this infrastructure operator, folks typically responsible for deploying and managing and upgrading the clusters. Anthos is our hybrid cloud platform. Like I mentioned, you can deploy it on GCP, you can deploy it on your cloud providers, you can deploy it on-prem. And it essentially takes all those great features that we offer with GKE and then makes them available anywhere, right? So those things like the auto scaling and the auto upgrades and auto repairs, right? You now can leverage them out in other cloud providers using that infrastructure, and allows you to adapt this multi-cloud strategy. So if you wanted to run Kubernetes in AWS, you wanted to standardize on your control plane, and you wanted that, say, 15,000 node per cluster scalability, you could leverage Anthos and come in and deploy an Anthos cluster into your AWS infrastructure, and then gain those benefits of GKE, even though they are residing within your AWS VPC. Anthos is great. It provides this turnkey production grade Kubernetes deployment. So a lot of those things that if you've ever bootstrapped a Kubernetes cluster before, it kind of does all that stuff out of the box. It has a centralized control plane that is hosted within Google Cloud. So Google automatically takes care of that highly available control plane, the security, auto scaling, all that stuff is just managed on the Google side. And it's really easy to get up and running with. So we have a bunch of quick start guides on GC on the Google Cloud homepage that allow you to get up and running either within Google Cloud or within one of the other cloud providers.
So Noah, you may go into this later in your conversation, but so the control plane stays inside of GCP and the worker nodes run inside of AWS. And do you guys have to set up what kind of connectivity do you have to set up? Is there any kind of special VPN, or is it just over the public internet? Am I getting too technical too fast in your presentation?
No, it's a great question. So the standard deployment, yes. So the nodes need to be just like any Kubernetes deployment. The nodes need to be able to kind of talk back to the control plane. So everything's over TLS. Everything's obviously encrypted. They do need to communicate back to Google. We do offer what's called Anthos private mode. So Anthos actually will deploy a highly available control plane in, say, your VPC. So if this is more so targeted for folks that do like business with government and highly regulated industries. So if you needed a completely confined, isolated Anthos cluster, you could actually leverage Anthos private mode, which is in true Google fashion in the process of being renamed. I don't remember what it's being renamed to, but so I'll just refer to it as private mode. But it gives you the ability to keep it, like deploy a completely confined cluster in, say, your VPC, right? And it'll deploy the control plane for you. But typically, yes, you would need some kind of egress, whether via like a NAT gateway or something from your VPC through an internet gateway to be able to talk back to Google's control plane.
Okay.
So we provide this unified management hub, right? So similar to something like Rancher, you now get this single pane of glass for all of your Kubernetes clusters across your entire multi-cloud and hybrid cloud footprint, right? So we have this concept of a fleet. A fleet is essentially like a series of clusters that match in configuration, right? So if I wanted to, say, deploy an app and I had users in India, I had users in the UK, I had users in the United States. Say I had users in a region that Google Cloud did not support or Azure did not support, and I needed to essentially leverage. I wanted my app to be running as close as possible to my end users, but there was no single cloud provider that really offered regions where all my end users are located. You could essentially deploy a fleet, which is a series of clusters, and match them in configuration so that my cluster running my application in this particular region in the AWS matches the cluster's configuration that runs in this region in GCP, which matches the one in my data center. And then you get insight into that fleet of clusters via the Google Cloud Platform Control Plane in this unified management hub, right? So we aggregate things like logs and metrics from all of your Anthos clusters into this single pane of glass. You get insight into all of the workloads that are running across each of your clusters, regardless of where they live. And then we'll talk we'll dive into the service mesh piece, but we'll talk about how you can actually control like east-west cluster routing and stuff via Istio. So yeah, so this got a little bit ahead of myself. This is essentially the concept of a fleet, right? So this blue box here is essentially a fleet which we have deployed across the three major cloud providers, and then you can choose where you want to deploy your services. If I only want to deploy it to 2 clusters in the fleet, you have that ability, but you can kind of match the clusters in configuration. Okay, so Anthos Config Manager, or ACM. This is kind of how we have that concept of a fleet, and we keep our clusters in our clusters configuration in sync. So this, again, is targeting that persona of the infrastructure operator, someone who's typically managing the clusters. So Anthos Config Management, or ACM, is essentially a GitOps-based workflow / automation suite that we have built to kind of manage the configuration of your clusters. So essentially, you will create a Git repository, and that Git repository will contain like manifests very similar to a Kubernetes manifest, where you define the configuration of your cluster as code. That configuration is then we have a couple of different components to ACM. One is constantly basically polling the Git repo to check for changes. When it detects a change, it will take that declarative configuration and then apply it against the fleet in which it's defined for. right? So you can continuously enforce like compliance policies. You get this, because we're leveraging GitOps and everything's version controlled, you get this end-to-end auditability of all the changes that you've made to your fleets. And then you can kind of think about your clusters as code the way that you would your applications as code with Kubernetes manifests. So ACM covers two key areas. One is config management, which we just kind of talked about, right? So say I have this fleet of clusters across multiple providers, and I wanted to create a namespace in each of them, right? I can just define that namespace in my ACM configuration, and then it will go ahead and deploy that namespace across each of the clusters to keep them in sync. The GitOps model kind of provides like that RBAC mechanism. So if you have access to the repository to accept a pull request, close a pull request, you have the ability to go ahead and actually make changes to your fleets, your Kubernetes clusters. But another key critical piece of this is policy management, right? So we've seen a lot of folks that are custom creating Kubernetes admissions webhooks, mutating webhooks. They're kind of writing Golang from scratch using the standardized like webhook framework for enforcing policies across their cluster. So I've done this in the past. It was actually before webhooks were a thing. We had like a shared OpenShift cluster for the organization, and we were allowing folks to spin up namespaces, but we didn't really have any insight as to what those namespaces were being used for. So when the inevitable time came that our cluster has hit capacity, we need to start scaling down pods, we didn't really have any insight as to like, is this important if I shut this down, or is this just someone's sandbox dev environment that they played around with 6 months ago and hasn't been touched? So from scratch, we wrote a Kubernetes controller, which essentially listened for namespace events, so when they were created or updated, and then it would enforce that we had particular labels on that namespace, right? So we would have a cost center label, which would map back to that development team's cost center that we could do chargeback for. We would have the environment. So was this dev, was this test, was this prod? The name of the application ID from our like CMDB, all those things. That's something we had to write from scratch in Golang, right? So as developers, wasn't a huge deal for us, but we understand that Google understands that not everyone has that skill set, and there's a lot of overhead that goes into writing these custom operators and controllers, and now we have the concept of these webhooks. So we have this policy management framework leveraging OPA, where you can actually define your policies via the Rego language, which if you're not familiar with, Rego is a language that OPA uses to basically, you can scan like static configuration. So a lot of folks are using it to kind of scan Kubernetes manifests, Terraform configurations, anything that can be defined declaratively as code. So we have this custom essentially admissions or mutating webhook that is mapped to ACM, and then you can define your cluster's policies as to, you have to pull your container images have to be signed, right? Or you have to do, I don't know, you have to have some kind of label on a namespace. You have to follow some kind of naming convention for your pods. You have the ability to define that via Rego policies, and then that gets applied as a custom controller, which lives within each of your Anthos clusters. So it gives you this ability and this framework where now you're just writing the policy as code in terms of Rego, rather than actually building a Golang binary to kind of play this role of the admission webhook or the mutating webhook. And then service management, which is our Anthos service mesh. So this is targeting the role of the service operator, or SRE. So Anthos service mesh is essentially a managed offering of Istio, which kind of out of the box comes with your Anthos deployment. It used to just be standard. I think now it's being offered as like you can opt in or out whether you want to deploy ASM or not. But if you're not familiar with Istio, right, it is a service mesh that is built around Envoy. Essentially, it deploys in all of your pods. It will deploy a sidecar container, which acts as the proxy and for all the network traffic between pods in the cluster. Right? So it has this idea of zero trust networking. Everything has an identity. So typically in a Kubernetes deployment, if I have a namespace and I have pod A and pod B, each is mapped to a service, those can just natively talk to each other, right? There's no real networking. There's no firewalls. Istio gives you that ability to define networking policies to say pod A or deployment A, all the pods in deployment A can talk to all the pods in deployment C, but they can't talk to the pods in deployment B. It enforces mutual TLS, so all the traffic between your pods is now encrypted. And then it also gives you this awesome observability into your entire stack, right? So I now get to see what services are talking to each other, and then collect metrics on what are the latency when pods in deployment A talk to pods in deployment B. And it kind of enables that SRE type role to start establishing service level agreements, SLAs, and getting insight into your cluster and how your actual applications and microservices are talking to one another. So how does a service mesh help? We provide this uniform observability. So this deployment of ASM across all your clusters aggregates and collects your metrics back to a single pane of glass. So if I have 10 different clusters across on-prem, AWS, Azure, I now can see all of the traffic between those clusters, or between the pods in those clusters in my Google Cloud Console. You can use the traffic routing policies to actually enable east-west traffic. So obviously, this is dependent upon the foundational infrastructure of like, is this VPC deployed with this VPC, or are there VPN tunnels between? But as long as that foundational infrastructure is in place, I can now use Istio's routing policies to say that my cluster in AWS is allowed to talk to my cluster in GCP, but not my cluster in Azure. And then you have this policy-driven security, right? So you can secure access and communications between all or some of the services that run between your clusters. We get centralized view of logging and monitoring, and then the typical APM to take a look at how our applications are actually performing out in the environment. There's tracing, so we can see how a particular request navigates its way through the entire microservices stack, what the latency is around that, and then there are profilers, right? So how much memory and CPU are my services actually consuming? So this final persona is targeting the developer, right? So the person that actually is building microservices, writing apps, and deploying on top of Kubernetes. So Cloud Run is one of Google Cloud's managed serverless offerings, right? You essentially feed it a container, and it will scale that container from 0 to essentially as many instances as you need. And until now, or until Anthos was released, this was confined to just the GCP ecosystem, right? With Anthos, anywhere that Anthos can run, you can extend Cloud Run, right? So it's all built around Knative, if you're familiar with, Knative framework. But as long as I build my applications around Knative, I now can run my applications that scale from 0 to X amount of instances across any of my cloud providers using a single, like I don't have to rewrite something for Lambda versus Google Cloud Functions versus Azure Functions, right? I have this single unified, like this actually enables this whole idea of cloud agnostic where you really can just build it once and then it allows it to really run anywhere. Supports gRPC as well as HTTP. It does things like it'll natively handle DNS resolution, and you can run it pretty much anywhere. I didn't mention this, but so Anthos actually now we have these various profiles for like in terms of what a cluster needs to be able to run. We just recently, within the last month or so, released an edge profile. So you can actually run an Anthos cluster on an edge device. So I think the bare minimum is like 4 gigs of RAM. I forget how many cores, but it's pretty light. So if you wanted to run clusters on, you could probably run it on like a Raspberry Pi or something. I haven't, don't hold me to that. I haven't tested it, but I thought that was pretty cool. So you now have this single control plane that really can run pretty much anywhere. So Anthos is really built around this one-click ecosystem. So this is, I think, is one of the really big value adds for Anthos. So we have this marketplace for Anthos, which has these pre-packaged solutions from Google as well as other third-party vendors, where you can just kind of come in and one-click deploy, right? So it's all built around Helm charts. There's a lot of great documentation in terms of architecture diagram. But for example, if I wanted to come in and deploy like, what's the Kubernetes Jenkins? Is it Jenkins X? I think Jenkins X is an offering, or GitLab. I can just kind of come in and say, give me a GitLab instance that's deployed across this fleet in these 3 clusters, or just this one particular cluster. And I don't have to now deal with actually pulling the Helm charts, configuring the values.yaml file, deploying the Helm chart, and then kind of managing that lifecycle. Is just the marketplace has these prepackaged solutions that you can kind of just click and deploy. And then because they're managed via the marketplace, you can have managed updates as well. So if there are new releases of the software that you've deployed to your cluster, there's mechanisms for actually going ahead and via the marketplace upgrading that software in place. We have this one-click VM migration. So if you're not familiar with the Migrate suite, which is a part of Google Cloud, we have Migrate for Anthos. So this is a really sweet piece of tooling. You essentially can run this CLI utility against a server, either in your database, in AWS, like an EC2 instance, a VM in Azure. If you have a monolithic or any kind of application deployed on that server, it actually will kind of reach in, it'll understand what application and processes are running on it, what the dependencies of that application are, and then it'll go ahead and containerize that application for you, generate the Kubernetes manifests to deploy it as like a deployment in Kubernetes on top of Anthos, and then as well as produce CI/CD artifacts for controlling the lifecycle of that application. So say you have something deployed that on a server, you really quickly want to migrate to a container-based architecture, you can leverage Migrate for Anthos for that. And from what I've read, there is no like language, it's not like language specific, right? So I know that there are a couple other offerings from some of the other cloud providers that support like either Java or .NET. I don't believe there's any language constraints to Migrate for Anthos, right? If an application is running, you've written something in Python, it knows how to package that up as a container, package the required dependencies, and then generate the corresponding Kubernetes manifests as well as CI/CD artifacts for pipelines.
So is it an agent?
And then this is the cool thing.
Sorry.
So it's not agent-based.
Okay.
Go ahead. Yeah, it's not agent-based.
How
I
does it
have
figure
not
out everything? Okay.
Yeah, I couldn't speak too accurately to it. I'm assuming you probably need RDP or SSH access into the server, and it kind of reaches in. But I know that it is not agent based. I definitely can pull some more information as to how it actually works if you're interested.
Okay. It seems like a very interesting tool because I know that's a lot. I mean, as a consultant, I can understand we have lots of customers who are trying to migrate their legacy infrastructure, get out and exit the data center. And that is one of the exercises we go through. It's like, we understand what's the total cost of ownership, how many application servers do you own, how many apps are you running, and being able to very quickly assess that and do the migration would be interesting to learn a little bit more about that one-click migration.
Yeah, I can definitely pull excuse me. I can definitely pull some documentation together for you and send that over. I'm curious, like the technicals, how it works as well myself. I know there's a couple competing products out there for like migrating from a server to a container, or just migrating from a server in your data center to, I don't know, some cloud instance. But from what I've read, and I'm curious to play with it myself, this seems like the most extensive in terms of functionality and what it can do. And Migrate is really, it's like a parent product, right? So there's Migrate for Anthos, but then there's also Migrate for Compute Engine. So you could, if you wanted to stick with a server-based architecture, you could migrate from on-prem or AWS or Azure into a GCP compute instance. And the Windows functionality, again, that's pretty impressive. So not sure how that works.
Yeah, that's that really is magic.
Okay. So hybrid AI. This is another cool feature. So as part of this one-click ecosystem, right? So I don't know if you've worked with Google Cloud before, but we have a lot of these great pre-built AI models for doing things like speech to text, text to speech, language translation, image classification, video analysis, that kind of stuff, which we offer as public APIs as part of Google Cloud. If you need to run those models at the edge, if you are leveraging Anthos, you can actually use this ubiquitous Google AI functionality, which will take those models and deploy them into your cluster wherever they're running. So for latency purposes, your service needs to you need to run data through a particular model. It wants to live as close as possible to that model. You can actually deploy a containerized version of the model into your Kubernetes cluster with one click. And then, like I said, with the GitLab example, right? So there's a bunch of validated third-party solutions, all have been vetted, and they're all available through the Anthos marketplace for deployment into your clusters. We talked a good amount about Migrate for Anthos. Yeah, but it's targeting those that are looking for migrating your VM-based workloads to containers. I think there's Migrate for GKE as well. So you can migrate to just standard GKE. You can migrate to Anthos, or you can migrate to like Google Compute instances. The CI/CD artifacts, I think, is pretty neat. I'm not sure what CI platform it built it for. I would assume Cloud Build, being that's the Google Cloud native CI platform. But I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure if it has any other integrations with other CI/CD platforms. But this is a pretty cool tool. So that's pretty much it. I didn't cover. So you may have picked it up on your own, but the whole point of, so Google's kind of known as the data cloud. We're also known as the open source cloud, right? So a lot of our offerings are built, I would say, around the open source ecosystem rather than on top of. I will not name any other cloud providers, but I do know that there are some that like to take open source software and build proprietary wrappers around it. Google Cloud, a lot of our stuff you could essentially run on-prem as well. So we have services like Dataflow. Is it Dataflow, which is built around Apache Beam? I think it's Dataflow. And essentially, it's a managed Apache Beam instance. If you wanted to roll your own Apache Beam instance in your data center, you could use the same exact SDKs that you leverage, that you would use for Google Dataflow. Anthos follows that same pattern, right? So Istio is open source. If you want to go and roll a vanilla Kubernetes cluster on bare metal and deploy Istio, like, you can. You have the ability to build all this functionality yourself. We're not denying that. What the value of Anthos is we provide a lot of that management for you without locking you into our proprietary like APIs and systems, right? So you can build your applications to leverage things like a service mesh to be built around Kubernetes. And then if you needed to move off of Anthos, and I may get in trouble for saying this, but you could, right? So we're typically the whole platform is built around open source tooling. The intention is not to lock you in. ironic coming from a customer engineer that supports a sales team for Google Cloud, but it's pretty neat, I think, because I worked a lot with like OpenShift. And I know that in a lot of the Kubernetes offerings offer this, like they have their own flavor of Kubernetes, right? Like OpenShift has the route, which is essentially a wrapper around Ingress. And it makes migration a little bit more difficult, not impossible. You can always kind of revert back, but all of our stuff is made so that you can easily shift around as your organization sees fit. I was hoping to have a demo for you guys. I apologize. I was not able to get that approved. If you would be willing to have me back, I would love to be able to get that approved and do an Anthos demo for you guys if that would be of interest. But if you have any questions, let me know. I finished a little bit early considering we didn't do the demo. So.
Well, I'll hold you to that, Noah, since I'll be taking over, and might even have to up your game, and maybe we'll do a workshop. Maybe have some stuff for folks to be able to interact with a little bit more. This seems like a really great tool. One of the questions I like to ask, because I always talk to vendors a lot, what would you say is not a good use case for Anthos? It seems like there's a lot of really good use cases, but we all know there's not one tool is for every situation. But just to put you on the spot a little bit longer.
Would you mind if we stopped recording so I can answer? So my answer is gonna align with what the Google Cloud answer is, but Anthos is great for a multi-cloud strategy, right? I think a lot of organizations these days have just hopped on this multi-cloud bandwagon. And I gave a talk a couple years ago at one of the last two companies ago that I worked at. We had like this big tech conference internally, and I gave a talk trying to I debunk this idea of multi-cloud is always good, right? So I used to be an architecture advisor. I would do a ton of architecture reviews, and folks would bring in their architecture diagrams, and I'd be like, okay, great. Like, why did you make this decision? And the answer would be because it's cloud agnostic. And I'm like, okay. And a lot of people just take that at face value and they're like, oh, well, cloud agnostic is good. Cloud agnostic can be good, but you need to understand why you would want that, right? So this is more so, this might be a cop-out. This is more my generic answer to when is Kubernetes not the best for the workload. It's like, it could be overkill, right? You need to really make sure, does your organization really need a multi-cloud strategy? There are a lot of cases where it makes sense, right? Say you're in financial services and regulatory requirements require you to have a presence in multiple clouds. Well, then great. It makes sense to kind of standardize and build things to be cloud agnostic. So if you need to shift, you can. But we talk a lot about in cloud architecture, this idea that lift and shift is bad, but cloud agnostic is good. And if you really boil down the foundational principles of those architectures, the logic is conflicting, right? Lift and shift is bad because it does not enable you to take full advantage of the managed services and do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. So you typically lift and shift is like a starting point, right? Get yourself into the cloud, get your data into the cloud, and then it's easier to kind of re-architect and build from there. But it's never the end all be all, right? You always want to start taking advantage of, if I don't have to have an engineer writing this from scratch, why would I? Just pick the best tool for the job and move on. But then if you think about cloud agnostic, why would you want that? You want cloud agnostic because you want portability. And we can dive into why you would want portability and vendor lock-in and all these other things. But well, if cloud agnostic enables portability, doesn't that by default mean it's enabling lift and shift, right? So Kubernetes is great, but it's not always the best tool for the job in general. If I just need to write a quick API, leverage Google Cloud Functions, leverage AWS Lambda, whatever your cloud provider is, should be on Google Cloud, but whatever your cloud provider of choice is, right? Pick the best tool for the job. Don't you don't always have to rewrite this boilerplate code. And one of my favorite memes is it's a truck driving down a highway. And it's got a huge flatbed attached, and then it's got one of those little toy cars sitting on it. And it's when you deploy your 10 user app on top of Kubernetes, and it's you don't need a full cluster for this single page static application, right? Just put it in a Google Cloud Storage bucket, enable it for site hosting. So it's
The
just
right tool for the right job.
exactly leverage the right tool for the right job. So
I'd agree. I'm a big Kubernetes proponent, but when clients come to me and I ask them the question, why Kubernetes, they just kind of like look at you because nobody like thinks about that. So it's like, you always want to evaluate, why are you using this tool? What's the business value that it's going to bring? Not just because this is the new hotness. So I'd agree with your assessment of that, Noah.
Yeah, I've often heard it say, hey, you have to ask why more than you have to ask why not.
Yeah, that's for sure. And especially Kubernetes. I mean, we kind of covered it in the beginning with who has open roles, right? Kubernetes in the last couple of years has been like the hot selling skill set, right? If you have Kubernetes on your resume, if you have CKA, like you're golden. You can go anywhere. So a lot of folks, I think, kind of just do it to kind of resume pad maybe. But it's not always the best tool for the job. It's great if you truly do need multi-cloud. And Anthos is great if you truly want to standardize on your Kubernetes platform for multi-cloud. But if you're just deploying a single page web app, you do not need Kubernetes. You do not need Anthos.
Agreed. Anybody else have any other questions for Noah? Well, I will definitely hold you to that, Noah, about the demo and possibly doing a workshop with us. But we shall see what you can and can't do. But with that, Jason, you have any closing words for us?
I just want to thank all of you for the last several years. This has been a really great meetup, and I'm thankful for all of you who've been involved. Speakers, sponsors, and all of you attendees, because that's why I got into this, was just to level up people. So very, very appreciative. You'll still see me in the community. I'm going into a Kubernetes role. Might even, if you're at KubeCon, I may or may not be there. Like, we're having a conversation this week. So yeah, thank you all again, and I'll see you in the community.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Noah.
Hey, thanks for having me, and we'll be in touch for that next session.
Look forward to it. Thanks, everyone.
Y'all have a good one.
Have a good night, everyone. Bye.